been diagnosed with PTSD, with TBI, with other infirmities of war, and then are ultimately discharged from the military with what we call a bad paper discharge, which is an other than honorable discharge. What that normally means is that that veteran did something that maybe they went AWOL because of their illness, maybe they acted out because of their underlying PTSD, but they committed some offense, they engaged in some conduct that caused them to get a discharge that was other than honorable. Now, for most of these veterans, that action, that conduct is a consequence of the PTSD, of the diagnosis that they received through their service to this country. But when a veteran gets a less than honorable discharge, which by the way is not a dishonorable discharge, right? There's vast territory in between an honorable discharge and a dishonorable discharge. When you get a bad paper discharge, often you lose eligibility for the services that will allow you to recover, to address that underlying injury that you received in war. For instance, many soldiers that get a less than honorable discharge lose their eligibility for VA. They lose their eligibility to actually get the mental health and medical services that they need to treat the injury that they received in war. Sometimes you lose your eligibility, your access to GI benefits, so that promise that was made to you when you went to fight for this country, that we were going to help you then get into the workforce, disappears. What we now know is that the scope of this problem is overwhelming. We're talking about, in the Army alone, over 20,000 veterans who have been discharged with bad paper, with a less than honorable discharge, who have an existing PTSD or TBI diagnosis. So these are soldiers that the Army, in this case the Army, know that they have a wartime injury. And despite that knowledge, they are still being discharged in a manner that often makes them ineligible for those services. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because there's an issue of conscience. We cannot allow for tens of thousands of soldiers who have fought and put their life on the line for this country to come back with injuries and then not receive care for those injuries. But in a much more immediate practical sense, the data tells us that veterans that have PTSD and then veterans who don't receive care for it, they are amongst the greatest risk of suicide. And in a world where one veteran is committing suicide every hour in this country, why on earth would we refuse to give care to people who we know are at greatest risk of taking their life? So Congressman O'Rourke and I have introduced the Honor Our Commitment Act. And I'll let Congressman O'Rourke talk a little bit more about it, but it's pretty simple. It says that for this category of veteran that we're talking about, you've served in combat, you have been diagnosed with an injury like PTSD, and you have been given a less than honorable discharge because of some conduct you engaged in, but not a dishonorable discharge, that you should be able to get medical care. And frankly, the VA has acknowledged that this is a problem. Just this year, they changed their policy, and they said that for veterans who are in this category, they will get, I think, 90 days of care? Is it 30 days of care?
They're going to get 90 days of care, tentative care.
Tentative care. So you're going to get 90 days of care, but only 90 days of care. And it's only for veterans who are in emergency situations with no definition of what emergency means. Yeah. So that's good news that there's been progress. It means that the VA admits that there's a problem here. But frankly, this needs to be a joint effort between the Department of Defense and the VA to solve this problem. And our legislation short circuits this slow walk that's happening in DoD and VA and just says, give care to these people. Give care to these people. And so we've introduced this bill. We think we're going to be able to get bipartisan support for it. This is a bigger problem than anybody thought, and I'm really pleased to be here with two great advocates for it. And Beto, thank you for your willingness to partner on this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us over. You and I were joking about the fact that when we typically do a Facebook live event, we're holding the camera up and filming it ourselves. So it's nice to be here with you in a more professional setting. And given the subject that we're talking about, and making sure that we reach the people who really care about this, who have been advocating for this, it's incredibly important that we do everything we can to reach as many people as possible. And I want to say a special thanks to those who are watching us on Facebook right now, to all the veterans and the family members of veterans whose advocacy and persistence and reaching out to Senator Murphy, to myself, and to others has really been the reason that we're even discussing this bill. I want to say thank you, and we're going to do our best, if you have questions and you post those as we're talking, to try to address some of those. But I just want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank the Senator for bringing us all together and for taking the lead on this issue on the Senate side, and bringing it a lot closer to reality. Just to build briefly on the Senator's comments, he mentioned a General Accountability Office, GAO report, that looked at discharges from 2011 to 2015. That GAO study found that there were 92,000 discharges for misconduct. There were 57,000 of those where there was some diagnosis for PTSD, TBI, military sexual trauma, some mental health care need that service member had at that time of diagnosis. And then of that group, in that 5-year period, 13,000 who had a discharge for misconduct, who had a mental health care condition like post-traumatic stress disorder, received an other than honorable discharge. And as Kris just pointed out, what that means functionally is that those veterans who most need our help are unable to get into the VA to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist or even a social worker. Most of them cannot even get into the VA at all. And to bring home the urgency of this issue, we know that those other than honorable discharge veterans, those 13,000 just in that 5-year period that we're talking about, are 2 times more likely to take their own lives. So this is about saving the lives of those veterans who have put those very lives on the line for this country and doing the right thing. I think to provide a brief overview of the bill, I'll just say that it goes beyond what Secretary Shulkin of the VA has done, and we are grateful for that in providing emergency services for these veterans who have an other than honorable discharge and need mental health care help, and ensures that every single one of them who has had a diagnosed mental health care condition while in service or up to 5 years after service can get into a VA and get the help that they need, be more productive in their lives, have better outcomes, and yes, save so many of those lives that we're losing today. Somebody else who has been absolutely instrumental in getting this legislation forward, building the advocacy behind it, and who we will be there to thank once it's passed and signed into law by the President, is Kris Goldsmith of the Vietnam Veterans of America. And the reason that I'm so grateful to him and to VVA is that their mission is not just to serve the Vietnam era of veterans. In fact, they were founded in part to make sure that no generation of veterans ever goes through what the Vietnam era veterans went through. Make sure that every veteran is treated with dignity and respect and has access to the services and the earned benefits that they put their lives on the line and that we guaranteed to them, and which is our obligation to fulfill. So thanks to Kris, who helps to run legislative affairs at VVA. Thanks to all the great VVA members out there who've been contacting me and Senator Murphy. We're getting really close to being able to take this great idea and move it past proposed legislation into signed law and helping those veterans out. So, Kris, I'd love to ask you to tell us and to tell the folks who are watching on Facebook what this legislation will do for veterans in America, why this issue is important to you, and to the degree that you feel comfortable doing so, would love for you to share your own story.
Sure. So, the first thing that I want to do is I want to thank you, Senator Murphy and Congressman O'Rourke, for working on this. One of my co-founders of an organization that I started to train veterans to become advocates is High Ground Veterans Advocacy, and a constituent of Senator Murphy's, Thomas Burke, is one of my co-founders, and he credits your intervention with saving his life in making sure that he still had access to the VA when he was discharged after surviving some very serious PTSD. So thank you so much for saving Thomas's life, because you've allowed us to work together to save more lives. So I got out of the Army about 10 years ago, but my story starts before then. I'm a New Yorker. I was born and raised in Long Island. I was close enough to the towers that when they fell, I saw the smoke from my hometown. I was in high school at the time. And although I had always wanted to join the military, that event kind of put a sense of urgency into it. And I joined the Army right after I graduated high school. I was in Iraq a year after graduating, or less than a year after graduating basic training, and I spent most of my time in Sadr City, Baghdad. As a forward observer, my job was to call for airstrikes, mortar strikes, that kind of thing. And I'm thankful that I never actually did that job, because in such a densely populated area, those type of weapons just really don't belong. But what my job ended up being was photo documentation of everything that my platoon did. And while that may sound kind of boring, when you're doing that at 19 years old and your job is to photo document mass graves, that's something that no one is ever prepared for. And while I dealt with random IEDs and some close calls with bullets whizzing by us, other than that, had a better deployment than a lot of people did. But it was a lot to go through at such a young age. It was a lot to go through as a human being. To see people murdered, to see children dead, is something that's extremely difficult. It's one thing to see videos of it, but to be the person who's taking the video, that's a really haunting experience. I came home from Iraq at the end of 2005 after a year-long deployment. I spent my 20th birthday in Baghdad, and from the moment that I stepped off the plane, my friends and family knew that something was wrong. It took me about a year to recognize that anything was going on, but I was self-medicating with alcohol. I was getting in fights. I just wasn't myself. Now, thankfully, I never got in trouble while I was in uniform. My uniform is kind of like a shield to me. When I put on my uniform and I went to work, I still excelled. I made sergeant in just over 2 years in active duty. And, I was well-liked. I had a lot of friends. But when I went home, that's when the demons came out. That's when I was drinking myself to sleep. That's when I was getting in bar fights. It wasn't until I found out that I was stop-lost, meaning that my active duty contract was extended involuntarily, that was kind of the last straw on my mental health. Although I had, at that point, a year after coming home from Iraq, started to finally find it, I guess, the bravery to ask for help from the Army, it was too late. I had let PTSD fester for too long. And again, at the time, I was 20 years old, 21 years old. I didn't know what PTSD really meant. I didn't know the signs, the symptoms. I wasn't aware of it in 2007 the way that most Americans are and soldiers are today. Memorial Day weekend of 2007, I went out onto a field where they plant a tree for every soldier who falls in combat in the 3rd Infantry Division. That place has always felt like a cemetery to me, and I chose that place as where I would attempt to end my own life. I took a fistful of Percocet that I had from a recent surgery and a bottle of vodka, which was my usual poison, and I attempted to take my own life. Thankfully, I survived. But from the moment that I woke up, I was treated like a criminal. I had been placed on a pedestal. My entire military career was exceptional up until my suicide attempt. And just a couple months later, by August of 2007, we're coming up on 10 years now, I was kicked out with what's called a general discharge. Now, a lot of people think that there are honorable discharges and that there are dishonorable discharges, but there's actually 5 different types. There's honorable, there's general, there's other than honorable, there's bad conduct, and there's dishonorable. At general, you lose your GI Bill. At OTH, you lose comprehensive mental health care and physical health care, which is important for a veteran's well-being no matter what. at bad conduct discharge and dishonorable discharge, those are for people who have actually had the right to due process, who were found guilty of a crime. I was simply accused of faking my mental illness, of faking the PTSD that was so obvious to everyone. And that's all it took to kick me out of the Army and to strip me of my GI Bill. Now, for all the complaints that people have about the VA, and the VA does have its problems, the VA is what saved my life. So I am fighting with Senator Murphy and with Congressman O'Rourke to make sure that every single veteran who's ever set foot in combat, who had been denied the due process rights of a court-martial, who are simply administratively, with the stroke of a pen, kicked out of the military, make sure that they have access to recover the same way that I have. Now, 10 years has been a long time, and I've recovered, and PTSD recovery is possible, but you can't do it alone. The VA has the most qualified doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers to help a veteran put their lives back together after they've served in war. And the Honor Our Commitment Act is simply a promise that most Americans think we're already making. I think that if every American, if every voter knew that there were 92,000 American veterans who had been administratively separated from the military, some of them with multiple tours, and then denied access to things like the GI Bill and even mental health, I think there would be outrage. And that's why we're hoping to get the attention of both parties in Congress, the House, the Senate, and the President. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, I have to thank Secretary Shulkin for recognizing that this is a problem, because previous secretaries have frankly just tried to ignore it as a way of artificially deflating demand at the VA. And what we need to do is make sure that everybody in Congress is paying attention to these veterans with PTSD. So thank you so much for doing this. And I think we're going to go to the live stream. We're going to answer some questions.
Yeah. So if questions come in, we'll answer them. But I'm going to pose one to you, and let Congressman O'Rourke jump in. So our bill is talking about a specific population, which are individuals that have been diagnosed, yep. Right? And yet you're working with an organization, right, entitled the Vietnam Veterans of America. And I think just to let folks know how big the scope of this problem is, right, we are getting so much better, right, today at identifying PTSD, identifying war injuries, and then getting folks treatment for it. But you have big populations left over from the first Gulf War, left over from the Vietnam War, who never got that diagnosis, who got bad paper discharges, who never got services. And so, this population that we're talking about is, 62% of service members who are separated have a diagnosis, but there's probably a lot more that don't have a diagnosis yet, and then you got to go back to prior eras to understand how big this problem is.
That GAO report only studied 2011 and 2015. This is an issue that my colleagues at Vietnam Veterans America have been working on literally for 50 years, since they returned home from Vietnam. I think it's heartbreaking to know that there are Vietnam vets who've been suffering from PTSD, who've been denied services for half a century. Vietnam Veterans of America, our founding principle is never again will one generation of veterans abandon another. And that's why we stand by Gulf War veterans who seem to have been forgotten by most people. That's why we're working on making sure that these changes, the Honor Our Commitment Act, is going to make sure that future generations of veterans are not denied health care at the critical point of when they're separating from the military.
I'm going to go run to join a hearing that I'm a little late for, and I'll let you guys finish up the conversation. You guys stick around. Make yourself at home here in the Senate recording studio. So,
thanks for doing this.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Senator.
And I added on about a foot and a half to your height by calling you Kris Humphreys rather than Kris Goldsmith. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Vietnam Veterans of America were instrumental in helping me understand the consequence and the cost of not addressing these needs up front. And they point to the fact that following the Vietnam War, it took 40 years to treat exposure to Agent Orange as a presumptive condition. The federal government knew for many years, for decades, that there was a connection between Agent Orange exposure and the cancers and other conditions that we were seeing among Vietnam veterans. VVA has been instrumental in pointing out that it's been 26 years since the Gulf War, and we still don't have an adequate VA and federal response from the exposures that those veterans endured that have resulted in Gulf War syndrome or other conditions connected to their service. It's clear that this country has really been challenged in accepting the full cost of going to war. It's not just sending the men, the women, the bullets, and the bombs overseas. It's accepting the cost for care and treatment and education and housing and connection to jobs that have function and purpose after service. That's such a big part of the cost of going to war. Linda Bilmes from Harvard estimates that the total cost of our current wars exceeds $1 trillion. She points out that 1969 was the peak year for VA demand from World War I veterans. From World War I, it was until 1969. And so, again, I'm struck by your service in uniform and your service out of uniform to ensure that we do right by all those who have served. And as you said, I'm confident, absolutely certain, Republican or Democrat, wherever you live in this country, if you know the facts that you just shared, that there are veterans, former service members, who put their lives on the line for this country, saved countless lives of other U.S. service members, who are today being denied their post-9/11 GI Bill benefits, who are unable to go in to a VA to see a mental health care provider, they would be shocked. They would also describe this as unconscionable, and they would want us to do the right thing. And I think they get behind the Honor Our Commitment Act, which was introduced with Mike Bost in the House, so it's a bipartisan bill, introduced with Senator Kris Murphy in the Senate, so it's bicameral. We have so many of the right things together on this. We just really need the help of those who are watching this, veteran service organizations, advocates for veterans, to help us push this over the line. Get your member of Congress, your senator, to sign on to this bill, make it a priority, meet it with the urgency that you described, and then we're going to be able to do right by these tens of thousands of veterans who've done right for this country. Any other thoughts in terms of the bill itself or the process by which honorable discharge veterans have gone through from service to civilian life?
Yeah, so I got to say it took me a long time to recover from coming home from war. Frankly, it took me years to accept that I even had a problem, even when it seemed so obvious to everyone else. And it took 5 years before I was ready to even start school. And because I don't qualify for the GI Bill, I have to take out loans, and it's expensive. But once I got back into school, I felt a purpose, a sense of purpose. I got back into being surrounded by other veterans who understood what I went through. And Student Veterans of America was an essential part of my recovery, because that's an organization where young student vets can become leaders. All you have to do is just sign up, get involved. You have the same type of small team camaraderie that you miss from the military. And I just want to encourage every single veteran out there, if you're in school, make sure that you've got a Student Veterans America chapter. Word of mouth, I think, is the most valuable thing to veterans. And when you get surrounded by other young vets, they've gone through issues at the VA. They've seen the barriers and they know how to overcome them. We do everything in the military as a team. And when you're surrounded by other student vets, you can overcome obstacles much, much easier.
We know of what the VA estimates to be 20 veterans a day in this country who take their own lives, that one of the largest, if not the largest cohorts, are Vietnam-era veterans. I was in San Antonio at a vet center, which for a lot of folks in the civilian population may not understand, is kind of apart from the VA medical centers, facilitates group therapy, has been a lifesaver in the words of those Vietnam-era veterans that I met there. And largely they found out about it by word of mouth. There's a question from Steve that I'd like you to answer, Kris.
Sure.
He wants to know if Senator Murphy and I and our co-sponsors and the Congress are able to get this done, get it passed. If President Trump signs it into law, how do we get the word out so that these then eligible, other than honorable discharge veterans, are able to get in to see a mental health care provider right away, and that we save lives and improve outcomes?
So one of the things that I'm concerned about is Secretary Shulkin is doing a great job by changing the rhetoric that we use about veterans with bad paper, saying yes, they can now, at this point, they can go and get emergency services. If this bill were to pass, it would make it so that they can get preventative mental health services, which I think is absolutely critical. If this passes, I would love to see a real partnership between the Congress and the VA to actually proactively notify every veteran who would become eligible for VA that they are welcome. You know, there is nothing more painful for a veteran than to be told that you're not a veteran. And that's what the VA has been telling some vets for decades with other non-honorable discharges. They say, well, according to us, you're not a vet. Imagine how much that hurts after sacrificing your youth, years of your life to fight in combat for your country, to have the VA be telling you that you're not a vet. You know, we want to undo decades of damage. We want to make sure that we proactively reach out. You know, you just held a veterans town hall. That's the type of thing that every member of Congress should be doing. Hold veterans town halls and let vets with bad paper know that if you've got PTSD, come to us, come to the members of Congress, come to veterans organizations and ask for help. You know, the VA does have its problems, but we're going to make sure that you get the care that you need.
Yeah, it's going to be incumbent upon the VA, if this passes, to get the word out to veterans, incumbent upon members of Congress, House and Senate, to let their constituents know. And I absolutely know, because it's true for any success that we have in serving veterans, that our veteran service organizations, be it VVA, American Legion, IAVA, or others, are going to be instrumental in continuing to be those advocates for veterans, making sure that they understand what they're eligible for. I'm being reminded by Samantha from our team that the bill also requires the VA to notify every eligible veteran. So Steve, to your question, the law will mandate that the VA get in touch with these veterans, but I think, as Kris and I are agreeing, it's also incumbent upon all of us to reinforce that, share that message, make sure that we do right by those who've done right by this country. We've got less than a minute left, and so I want to thank everyone who has tuned into this live stream. I want to encourage you to continue to get in touch with me, VVA, Senator Murphy, and others who are working on this issue to answer your questions, to get your best ideas on how we improve this, and also build on this. I think, Kris, you were, and Senator Murphy said this as well, this by no means addresses all of our problems related to this issue, but it is a terrific start that's going to do a world of good for a lot of veterans who need our help right now. I'll let you take the last 30 seconds with any closing thoughts. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So the number one thing in order to get this bill passed is we need the House Veterans Affairs and the Senate Veterans Affairs committees to hold hearings. Now, we don't want to hold a hearing just on this bill. We want a hearing on the topic of bad paper. So contact the chairman and the ranking members of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House and Senate. Thanks so much for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Kris.